Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Carolyn Eisenberg entitled Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, published by Oxford University Press just 10 days ago. Our discussants this afternoon are Pierre Aslan of San Diego State University and Frederick Logovoy of Harvard. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic and post-pandemic era, here in the virtual realm. A few FYIs before we get started. First, today's session is sponsored by the Wilson Center, co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Asia program. And we ask you to take note that next session will be on Monday, the 6th of March, and we'll focus on a recent book by Claire Rydell Arsenis, America's Philosopher, John Locke in the American Intellectual Life. Third, as always, we like to recognize two people whose behind-the-scenes efforts make the seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the AHA. And then finally, on the logistics front, please note that today's session, as always, is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. With those preliminaries out of the way, I turn the Zoom screen over to my co-chair, Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian, all yours.
Thanks, Eric. I'm delighted to introduce our featured speaker, Carolyn Eisenberg. Carolyn, Rusty, is a professor of U.S. history and American foreign policy at Hofstra University. Her previous book, Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944 to 1949, won the Stuart Bernath Book Prize and the Herbert Hoover Library Book Prize, and was a finalist for the Lionel Gelber Book Award. Her book, Fire and Rain, as Eric just mentioned, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, was published by Oxford University Press just a few days ago. Carolyn has lectured widely, published numerous articles on issues of war and peace, and she was a consultant with the New York Historical Society for their exhibition on Vietnam, as well as to visiting historians from Vietnam interested in using American archives. She has also, I should note, at the Wilson Center, she's also worked with several congressional offices on foreign policy issues, and is presently, or has been, engaged or has served as legislative coordinator for Historians for Peace and Rusty, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. And I want to just thank the staff at the Wilson Center for their help in setting this up, and Fred and Pierre and Eric as well for inviting me. It's really an honor to be doing this presentation. I've been writing this book for a long time, as many people know. And over these many years, people ask me periodically, oh, I hear you're writing a book. Well, that's interesting. What is it about? And then I say Nixon, Kissinger, and the wars and the Vietnam War. And then there's often this sort of awkward silence, which doesn't necessarily dissipate when I add relations with Russia and China. With varying degrees of tact comes the follow-up question. Aren't there already a lot of books on this subject? Is yours really different? So given that experience, I had to answer that question, at least for myself, many times. Why am I writing this book? One easy answer pertains to the volume of declassified documents. We'll never have such complete information about the policymaking of any administration again. Certainly the thousands of presidential tapes from 1971 on and the thousands of transcripts of Henry Kissinger's telephone calls are an extraordinary resource. And apart from the specific features of this administration, there's much to be learned about larger patterns of US decision-making at the highest levels. In writing this book, I wanted to illuminate certain matters which had been relatively neglected. And I'm just going to briefly state what they were and then try to turn to the substance of my discoveries. So let me mention these. I especially wanted to highlight the impact of policy on actual people. What was happening on the ground in North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia? How were decisions that were being made in Washington affecting people's lives? I was also interested in the role of the anti-war movement, of which I was a part. It was hardly news that such a movement existed, but with this vast declassified record now available, could we more reliably learn about how the peace movement affected Nixon administration policy? Then the question of China and the Soviet Union. Many historians and journalists at the time and forever after had noted the irony that while brutal warfare was occurring in Southeast Asia, at the same time Nixon and Kissinger were being wined and dined in Moscow and Beijing, apparently having a fine time. Was this simple coincidence? Well, unlikely. But how exactly did these developments connect with each other? Much of the existing literature had focused almost exclusively on Nixon and Kissinger themselves. And they're colorful people, and in some ultimate sense, they were the deciders. But they were not empowered to act alone. They were operating within a framework of large national security bureaucracies. So how did their practices and decisions fit with those longstanding powerful institutions? And then looming over this entire story is, of course, the issue that historians, and notably Fred Laird, have wrestled with for over decades. Why did this flawed, costly, ill-fated, tragic Vietnam War continue over so many years? I should say from the outset that none of these questions were pulled out of a hat. They came directly from my teaching and the issues that emerged in class discussion. 25 years ago, a student raised his hand and said, "I don't get it. If Richard Nixon was such a brilliant politician, why didn't he just blame his predecessor for the Vietnam mess and get out?" In the time allotted, I want to cover a few points. What was happening on the ground? In constructing my narrative, I tried to identify experiences of particular people that illuminated important aspects of the war. And I wanted to give names to those people. For potential readers of my book, I wanted to lend reality to the consequences of policy decisions reached in Washington. In making that effort, I also found a partial answer to my last question, which is how and why did this war go on? An important feature of the situation was the extraordinary detachment of the principals from the suffering caused by their decisions. When White House emissaries went on fact-finding missions, they avoided places and sources who could clarify the damage for them. By the end, Al Haig became the observer Nixon and Kissinger most trusted, but his fact-finding missions were limited to Allied officials and to other military personnel. Overarching these practices is something so basic historians easily ignore it, which is life in the national security bureaucracies entailed emotional disconnection. You can read through thousands of pages of government transcripts, which I did, and find minimal upset or concern about costs to actual people, not even Americans. Privately, there may have been an array of unexpressed feelings, and presumably there were, but the norms of decision-making required silence. There are famous exceptions. For example, the people on Henry Kissinger's staff who quit in protest over the invasion of Cambodia. Yet as one of these men, Roger Morris, described, quote, "There was for staff members the pernicious problem of discussing outrageous, irrational official policies in the cool, bloodless language of cost effectiveness and manliness the culture of government seemed to demand. Not for the first or last time, a policy in Indochina that seemed to warrant screaming was too gently opposed." According to the declassified telecons, on November 23rd, 1969, Kissinger called Secretary of Defense Laird about My Lai. The president wanted to make sure, he said, that Laird had a game plan. What's your game plan? Laird responds, did Kissinger have the pictures? He wanted to know. He didn't. The secretary asked Kissinger, would he like to look at them? And Kissinger says, well, do you think I should? And Laird says, you might as well not, they're pretty terrible. Millions of people around the country had already seen these horrific photos in Life magazine, but Kissinger is questioning whether he should open the pages. I assume he finally did look, and this example is perhaps apocryphal, but the moral indifference is stunning. My Lai is a public relations problem, not a human tragedy. What made this and other news of atrocities a public relations problem, what made this a public relations policy problem was, of course, the power of the anti-war movement. From day one, Nixon had clearly in mind the fate of Lyndon Johnson, who was mortally damaged by domestic dissenters. And from the outset, he and Kissinger viewed the peace movement as dangerous. Within that context, they regarded negative news stories like My Lai as something to be discounted and discredited. Nevertheless, the peace movement had a profound effect on policy in ways that many of us failed to appreciate at the time. The most important effect was the removal of US troops from Vietnam. Nixon had begun this process in the summer of 1969, taking out troops in increments of 30, 40, and 50,000. Everyone I knew in the peace movement said, this is a trick. He's expanding the war. He's accelerating the bombing. Look what he's doing in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnamization. Nothing great about changing the color of the corpses. And certainly there was merit in these claims. But overlooked was the fact that by the fall of 1972, the US had almost no combat troops in South Vietnam. And since both Nixon and Kissinger viewed ARVN, the South Vietnamese military, as lacking in effectiveness, this created a necessity for the administration to make a rapid peace agreement. I also want to add here that Kissinger recognized the danger of truth withdrawals from the outset, as did the US military in Saigon and also Washington. But this was one line Nixon, the politician, drew. He believed that these withdrawals were absolutely essential to counteract the peace movement and convince the country he was ending the war. We're one step ahead of the sheriff, was a Nixon phrase. And by this, he meant Congress. Moderate groups within the anti-war movement had concentrated on political action, building the candidacy of George McGovern for president in '72 and seeking to elect more anti-war people to the House and the Senate. The more radical anti-war groups viewed this as wasted energy. Members of Congress kept making speeches, introducing resolutions that never passed. And on election day, George McGovern was defeated by a landslide. However, when you look at the record, this point of view seems myopic. In his concession speech, McGovern had uttered words more apt than he realized. Quote, there can be no question at all that we have pushed this country in the direction of peace. And if we have shortened the Vietnam War even by days, then every minute, every hour, every bone-crushing effort in this campaign was worth it. Indeed, one accomplishment of the McGovern candidacy was to move the Democratic Party into an anti-war position. And this mattered in Congress, where anti-war resolutions were gathering steam. And that goes back to the issue of troop withdrawals. As grumpy as he was about taking these thousands of troops out, Nixon believed it was a political necessity. To defeat those anti-war resolutions, he needed to keep preempting the peace advocates by taking more men out. Also buried under the McGovern landslide was the fact that more anti-war candidates were elected to Congress, with the result that in the week following the 1972 election, 3 of Nixon's strongest congressional allies, Senators Stennis and Goldwater, plus Gerald Ford, paid him a visit to say once the new Congress came into session, they would no longer have sufficient votes to pass appropriations for Vietnam unless a peace treaty was signed. Therefore, the message to Kissinger was to get this done. Regardless of the conflicts he had with the North and South Vietnamese, he needed to close the deal and get the American troops and prisoners home. And so he did. Kissinger will go to his grave insisting that domestic forces undermined his diplomacy. And because of his habit of lying, those claims are often ignored. But they contain an important truth, that he was not free to handle negotiations on Vietnam in the way he would have preferred. For example, in December 1972, he wanted to extend the Christmas bombing for an additional 6 months. Nixon was politically astute enough to say no. But the fallacy in Kissinger's repeated presentations is in believing that absent anti-war pressure, that the United States would have won in Vietnam. But there's no reason to think it's true. Given the limitations of time, I'm not able to discuss the diplomacy with the Soviet Union and Russia, except to say that many of the declassified transcripts are remarkable, along with the detailed reports by Russian Ambassador Dobrynin to his superiors in Moscow. What is apparent from those documents, which neither Bernath nor Zhou Enlai could miss, was the desperation of Nixon and Kissinger to get their help in pressuring North Vietnam to accept U.S. terms and in burnishing Nixon's image as a man of peace. And to that end, you see Kissinger making concessions on arms control and Taiwan that were largely hidden at the time. What is the significance of that? From the outset, U.S. military intervention in Southeast Asia had been justified by the need to demonstrate credibility to the communist superpowers, Soviet Union and China. For millions of Americans, this was a worthy goal, and tens of thousands had sent their sons off to war, believing that was the reason. Perhaps true at the beginning, but by 1972, this was no longer the case. We're not displaying strength to Moscow and Beijing. If anything, the opposite was true. And while news commentators may not have noticed, the administration's rhetoric about credibility had subtly shifted. Instead of demonstrating credibility to the communist superpowers, the relevant audience was now our allies, showing them that the United States will be reliable in defending their interests. So why did this devastating project go on for 4 more years? There's no single answer to that question. A variety of factors converged, including the distinctive personalities and ideology of Nixon and Kissinger. But that only takes us up to a point. One simple point is the desire back then to avoid a Joe Biden moment, except they didn't know about the Joe Biden moment, but to avoid what just happened in Afghanistan, the fear that a precipitous withdrawal would have the enemy pouring into Saigon with all the domestic recriminations that would occur. In that sense, this enterprise was more about domestic credibility than international concerns. Also significant was their indifference to human costs, which among other effects made them oblivious to how the suffering they were causing was undermining the effectiveness of their policies. There's a familiar dichotomy that we say all the time in which morality and pragmatism are counterposed as opposites, But in this instance, they coincide. Not wanting to hear or credit the anguish of others nurtured a dangerous ignorance. Yet in explaining this ongoing Vietnamese war, perhaps the most important factor was the militaristic nature of the national security state. The dominance of the career military in decision-making, the ideological commitment to military supremacy, the unwillingness to accept a loss no matter the price paid by others. With regard to Vietnam, the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and of McPhee in Saigon weighed heavily. As they entered office, Nixon and Kissinger did a survey of government agencies and their attitudes towards the war. While there were variations in outlooks, nobody advocated withdrawal or anything like it. It is certainly true that Nixon and Kissinger were outsized personalities who left their stamp on events. But it's worth remembering that they were operating within an institutional frame in which the killing of people, soldiers and civilians, had been normalized. In concluding, I want to say why I did this project, despite the eye rolling of various people, and why it seems even more meaningful today. For many people of my generation, the Vietnam War was a moral catastrophe. so shocking in its impact that in varying ways it reshaped the rest of our lives. And of course, hating Richard Nixon was part of that orientation. But at the time, and in decades thereafter, my conversations with students left me feeling it was too much about that experience that I didn't really understand. And that led me to fresh study and to a great deal of time in the archives. But now in the present, this effort seems more important. As far as I can tell, we're in the era of the Great Erasure, where all horrific US interventions, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Libya, Iraq, are blacked out in the demonization of Putin and Russia. To be clear, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an appalling development which should be recognized and opposed in some fashion. But is their behavior something unique, a moral outrage unprecedented in human history? Have we really been living until now in a rules-based international order suddenly shattered by Putin? Are his crimes against humanity so extraordinary that the United States cannot make efforts to encourage negotiations or engage in diplomacy? With the resurrection of the Cold War in Europe and accelerating conflict with China, we cannot afford to confront these developments without some recognition of our own troubled history. I'm hoping my book will be a modest contribution to a necessary dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rusty. You put a lot on the plate here, so a lot to talk about. Before I introduce our first commentator, let me remind our viewers that you can participate. We hope that you will participate in this discussion a little later on. And you can start getting ready for that right now. Our preferred way for you to join us is by you are using the raise hand function. Then we can bring you at least your voice directly into the conversation. Or you can use the Q&A function. Then I will put your question or comment to our panelists. And you can queue up for both starting now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first commentator, Frederick Logovoy, the Balfour Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School, Professor of History at Harvard, a specialist on US foreign relations history and modern international history. Fred was previously the Enbinder Professor of History at Cornell, where he also served as Vice Provost and Director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. Dr. Logovoy is, of course, the author of a number of books. Many of you will be familiar with them, 10 books altogether, I think, right up to now. Most recently, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. His book, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam, won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for History and the 2013 Francis Parkman Prize, as well as the American Library in Paris Book Award and the Arthur Ross Book Award from the Council on Foreign Relations. Other recent works include America's Cold War, The Politics of Insecurity, published with Campbell Craig, and the college-level textbook, A People and a Nation, A History of the United States. A native of Stockholm, Sweden, Fred holds a PhD in history from Yale University. He's a past president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Fred, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is all yours.
Why, thank you, Christian. I'm just so pleased to be with all of you and to have a chance to talk about Rusty's terrific new book. Let me say a few words about why I think this book is such an important contribution, and then I have a few questions for Rusty, for Professor Eisenberg that maybe we can discuss. As she herself graciously said at the start, it's a book that was long in the making, and I would like to say a much anticipated, much awaited study. I've been familiar with this project for probably maybe a decade or so. And so I'm just delighted that it's now between two covers. And, it's interesting to hear people say to you, Rusty, that don't we already have a large number of books on this? To which I would say that, in fact, no. In fact, the one of the reasons I think this book is so important is that I think that we have some important works on this latter phase of the war, including by Pierre, who's, of course, on the screen with us today. I think this period, I think we're still sort of in the infancy of important work in this period that you've just told us so much about. So I reject the subtext of, I think, that question. I think that, you know, the period after Americanization, so 66 and 67, excuse me, I have a cough, is another area in which we need work, but so is this period of the let's call it the Nixon years. And so I think it's highly important that we have the book. Delighted to have it. It's right here. Those of you who haven't seen it, this is what it looks like. You need to get your hands on the book quickly. One of the things I really like about the book is that you contextualize, which is hard to do. I think it's incumbent upon all of us as historians to do that, but you contextualize, in particular, U.S. decision making for some of the reasons that you've already laid out in your remarks. I don't think I need to say more about that here, but I think it's highly important, and you do it. And I think for me, maybe this is something we can pursue. I think you demonstrate just how vital maybe the first 2 years, or say 69 to 71, just how important those years are. That's what comes through, I think, in the book. A substantial part of your narrative concerns those 3 years. Demonstrate for me just how important they are, and I have a question about it in just a second. I also like the close attention that you give to domestic politics. Ken Hughes and others, of course, have written about the domestic political dimension here and how much it matters in terms of U.S. decision-making. I think that's affirmed in your book, and maybe that's something we can also discuss. In my own work, this has been a theme with respect to Vietnam, decision-making under Johnson, and now, of course, I'm looking at Kennedy in this regard in the second volume of my biography, but also with respect to Nixon. And so that foreign domestic nexus and the degree to which concerns about domestic political imperatives drive this, or at least help drive it, I think is underscored in the manuscript. Much more I could say here to talk about the importance of this work. But again, I urge those of you who have not gotten your hands on the book to do so. So I guess the question, maybe this is a question that we can discuss a little bit. Concerns, I have several. We'll see how many I have time for. But the first would be this, and it's about 1969, Rusty. You write at least a couple of times early in the book, that Nixon and Kissinger lacked a clear strategy. And it seems to me this is a vital point. So the question is the strategy, to the extent that they have one, is it simply that by upping the level of violence, they can gain concessions in the negotiations somehow? They're not quite sure how they're going to get those concessions, but they can. Is that the essence of it? If so, it seems to me there's a kind of contradiction buried in this, because you also show, it seems to me, that there's pessimism, in keeping, by the way, with the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. That's something we can pursue. But pessimism behind closed doors that Saigon can survive, coupled with this determination to prevail. Talk a little bit, if you could, about the strategy that they have as you understand it.
Am I unmuted now? So
Yes.
I might respond to that. Well, I think at the beginning there's a lack of clarity on their part. You know, there was this idea that was, very present in that 1968, which is the idea that somehow or other you really could negotiate with Hanoi and get Hanoi to make enough concessions that it would look as though the project was coming to an end in a reasonably favorable way. And that idea that you could get a good deal from Hanoi if you just sort of talked the right way, I mean, that's present to some degree in the anti-war wing of the Democratic Party. So one of the things, there's some amount of discovery here. That Kissinger, when he starts out, having these talks, has the idea that he, can really convince the enemy to make a deal. And that somehow or other, you actually could end up with a situation where, there would be the North Vietnamese would take their troops out, the U.S. troops would, the U.S. would take their troops out, that somehow or other the Saigon regime could stay there, but there would be a procedure that would enable, the U.S. to leave with some optimism. So, I mean, I think it's very, murky in terms of what the exact idea was, but I do think there was some hope for a successful negotiation. Then they were, of course, continuing at that point in '69, they're also continuing U.S. military activity. And the other piece that's very important is really the bombing of Cambodia. In that secret bombing in the spring of '69. That's like very important, not just because it's secret, which is what people ultimately decided, and it isn't because they're just being gratuitously violent. I mean, one thing is that a lot of which is frankly what I thought at the time. What are they doing? Whenever I found out, like, why are they doing this? It's absurd. But actually, I mean, there were a huge amount of North Vietnamese troops in Cambodia, right, at the point that they do the bombing. And so that is a serious effort, very much promoted by the military, right, to attack North Vietnamese troops there, and if not, either to kill them or also to push them back. So they have kind of an amorphous idea that somehow or other, by being a skillful negotiator on the one hand and upping the violence to some degree on the other, that they could get an exit early on. But as you're moving into September, that's sort of going away.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that then happens is they are, and there's about to be a PBS documentary about this, is they're basically thinking that if they're not getting anything, that on November 1st, they are planning to significantly escalate the violence, perhaps bombing Hanoi again or whatever. They have all sorts of plans, and then that gets unsettled by the moratorium. Right? So that leaves them, in a place they didn't want to be. But it's one of the most straightforward examples of where anti-war activity really stops something that they absolutely intended, which is that they were going to try to really make it clear to Hanoi and to the Russians that the U.S. was very serious and was prepared to escalate.
So interesting. I would love to pursue that line a little further, but let me ask about Mel Laird, because one of the things you bring out in the book is just how important he is. And there's a forthcoming book by David Prentice. Maybe you know about David's book. It too shows, it seems to me, in unprecedented detail, both how interesting Laird is in this, and how much he is ultimately going to shape, in a sense, what happens. Can you just talk a few sentences about Laird and where he fits into the story?
I have a lot of sentences about Laird, but
just give us a few.
I'll do a few. The Secretary of Defense at the time, he didn't seem any different from the rest of them, at least in the outer world. He always defended the administration. But the thing about Laird that's really important is to keep in mind that he is, unlike the rest of them, he is a man of the Congress. He gets picked by Nixon because of his ability to operate successfully on Capitol Hill. And that's who his friends are people in Congress. So in some sense, his behavior doesn't just reflect the imperatives of the national security state. It reflects his friends, even in the Republican Party, who are often more anti-war than we actually realized at the time. And the basic thing that Laird does, which it is documented throughout my book, is he insists on troop withdrawal. And he is insisting on that from the summer of 1969, and he never changes. And he also makes it clear to Nixon, lest Nixon not notice, that they have to do this in order to maintain to maintain the support of the public. That if you want the public to believe that you are serious about getting peace in Vietnam and you're not, and the war isn't over, you're going to show them 40,000 men coming out, 50,000 coming out in these increments. So by the time you're getting into the fall of 72, there actually aren't any combat troops left, which I have to say the anti-war movement, including me, never bothered to notice, right? But that was Laird's constant theme, and partly what he did, I always think about him as like Schindler, is that he traded. In other words, Nixon made a variety of policy decisions, including going in, bombing Cambodia, well, that was secret, but going into Cambodia, etc. And numbers of, and a very silly, ultimately devastating program for Laos. And Laird doesn't agree with a lot of it. He thinks a lot of it's very unwise. But what he does for Nixon is he will go to Congress and, loudly, defend what the president has done and what the administration has done. And he does that right up until the last days of the first administration. And and he does that, but the trade-off is, and it's extraordinary. Say to Nixon, well, okay, remember we were going to get those 30,000 troops out? Remember we were going to get those 40,000 out, over and over. And I actually interviewed Laird by phone twice. And he didn't know me from a hole in the wall, but almost in the first 5 minutes of our conversation, one of the things he said, and I'm not sure it's an exact quote, but was something like, do you know how many kids I got out of that goddamn war? Right, that for him was the singular contribution. And I also think, and I don't know if Prentice goes into it, I couldn't, but there's a question of his family. His kids are protesting during this time. University of Wisconsin, which is where he's from, is exploding all during that time. And he's chatting all that time with his Republican friends in Congress, again, many of whom are very unhappy with the policy, but they aren't saying it publicly. So that was unknown. But that's a little bit of his reference group, are those Republicans.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Christian, do I have time for one more?
Absolutely, and then we'll bring Pierre into the conversation.
Then we'll go to Pierre. I guess I'll choose the following question then, and maybe we can come back to some others later that I have. But this one, Rusty, is perhaps the sort of inevitable question that you're going to get a lot. Maybe you are already getting it. I sense, I'll preface it with a sense that I have in the narrative. You can correct in the process of answering my question. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense a certain degree of empathy for the decision makers, and so I guess it's a two-part question. Did you, in the course of working on this for a great number of years, change your position on Nixon and Kissinger and the policies they followed, and that you became, though you're still critical, I think, ultimately of U.S. policy, there's a certain degree, and I think this is welcome in the narrative, in which you're able to put yourself in their shoes and see things from their perspective, which is empathy. So that's sort of the subtext of the question. The question is, in the context of its own time, so not hindsight, but in the context of 69, 70 in particular, was an alternative policy available to them? That is to say, a more precipitous disengagement from the war, taking what you can get, a kind of fig leaf settlement that they know is going to result in Hanoi takeover, though not perhaps for a certain, maybe there's a certain decent interval that you can get in that negotiation. Does that exist in the context of the time, or not?
Well, those are very hard questions. Let me just speak for a moment about my attitude toward Nixon and Kissinger. I have to say that through my research, I actually got less empathetic about Henry Kissinger than when I started. I felt like, his need to be the most important person in Nixon's world and his glorying in the publicity that he had, that made him extraordinarily indifferent to what was actually happening to people. He didn't project that outward. In other words, in his conversations with members of the press, he had a relationship with Kate Graham and others. He always presented to them as a very sensitive, anguished person. In fact, anguish is his favorite word. But in actuality, when you look at the decision-making process, especially when we look at those tapes that are now published, I mean, that his real indifference to the cost of things is very striking. So I think I got worse. And then I hate to acknowledge this, but I think my attitude towards Nixon at the end is affected more by Donald Trump than anything else, because certain qualities of Nixon that I had not paid that much attention to became more obvious. So what were they? One is he actually worked. He worked really hard. When you look through those documents, he'll get these transcripts that go on for 30 pages, and he's reading them as if he's like a PhD guy, and he's like got little comments on the margins and so forth. I mean, he actually did understand that he had a real job, that it wasn't just, getting on television and yelling at people. So I thought, wow, that's great. You have a president that wants to work, right? That's good. And the other thing that I think only again became apparent to me, later, is that whatever else was true, that he wanted to be a great president. He wanted to have some record of accomplishment. That was really serious. He understood that being in the White House entailed certain responsibilities. So as horrifying as his actual decisions were, I mean, millions of people died because of these terrible decisions. Nevertheless, it is really true that he wanted to accomplish something. And you see it very clearly with his trips to Moscow and then to Beijing, and that it's quite important to him that he be perceived as a man of peace. So it's ridiculous in a way. He's in Moscow, talking about Leningrad, and meanwhile in Anlak, American, planes are like pasting the place. Like people are dying all over. He doesn't even connect to that. So you have to notice that split. But it remains the case that he at least had some aspirations for the office to do something, which again, I might not have noticed without Donald Trump. So your other question, which I'm evading, is much harder, right? Which is in that context of that time, could he have done something different than what he did, right? Could any of them have done something different? And that's a really hard question to answer, because if you you think about Joe Biden and what happened with Afghanistan, and you imagine now that Richard Nixon comes in and, suddenly pulls the troops out and, maybe not immediately, but in a while the enemy takes over, that would have been politically costly. So in that sense, you're right. On the other hand, they ended up the same way. Right. In the end, they ended up with probably what they could have gotten, truthfully, and maybe would have even been in a better situation if they had done this in 1969 than if they did it in 1972. And of course, the critical thing that doesn't get figured in this, right, is destruction. It's how many people are going to die because you don't want to get the American public to be alienated from you, right? I mean, that's what happened. And they, again, the thing I would really emphasize is that they didn't end up with anything better than they could have had really at the beginning.
Yeah, it would seem, and I'm going to stop after this because it's Pierre's turn, but it would seem imperative to determine what they in fact believed in their heart of hearts was possible. If you conclude, as Richard Nixon, that this thing is probably not going to go well over the long term, that South Vietnam is not going to survive, then it seems to me, Fred Logovoy, incumbent upon you as President of the United States to take whatever terms you can get and get out. By the way, I don't think it's going to kill your re-election chances. I don't think it's going to harm American credibility, not irretrievably. But enough from me. Thank you, Rusty.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred, for the very thoughtful comments and questions, and also the good conversation. Pierre's been waiting patiently, so let me introduce him. Warm welcome to you, Pierre, to the Washington History Seminar. Pierre Aslan is the Dwight E. Stanford Chair in American Foreign Relations in the Department of History at UC San Diego. His area of primary expertise is the history of American foreign relations with a focus on East and Southeast Asia, the larger Cold War context. He's a leading authority on the Vietnam War and particularly interested, and I think will make a great sort of additional perspective to our conversation. He's particularly interested in decision-making of the Vietnamese communist authorities in the period 1954 to 1975. He's the author of A Bitter Peace, Washington, Hanoi, and the Making of the Paris Agreement, published in 2002, which won the 2003 Kenneth Baldrige Prize, and Hanoi's Road to the Vietnam War, 1954 to 1965, published in 2013, winner of the 2013 Arthur Goodside Book Award. His third book, Vietnam's American War, A History, was released in 2018 by Cambridge. It surveys the Vietnamese communist experience during the Vietnam War, with a focus on how the Vietnamese David succeeded in defeating the American Goliath. Dr. Aslan is co-editor of the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War, Volume 3, Endings, and forthcoming. It's forthcoming. And recently, his recent work on his fourth book project is focused on a history of the global Vietnam War. Pierre, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Zoom room is yours.
Thanks for this great introduction, Christian. I'm so envious. You guys are sitting in your libraries, and my wife stuck me in the kitchen because she's claimed our extra bedroom as her office. And so thank you for this wonderful introduction. It's a real honor to be with you today. Really happy to take part in this. Carolyn, as Fred said, I mean, the book is wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I really liked your treatment of the Laos invasion of 71. I mean, you see it as a turning point in the war generally, which had never really occurred to me. And I think you built a really great case for that. And I think that's bound to kind of force us to reconsider a lot of what we thought we knew about Vietnam. And I think that's why I love this field so much, is that in spite of all that we think we know about the war, right, that our thinking on it is constantly evolving. So I'm a Vietnam specialist. I study the war, as Christian intimated, mostly from the Vietnamese side, and I kind of want to focus on that in my comments. And I don't know if it's fair to you, Carolyn, because this is clearly a book about Nixon and Kissinger, but at the same time, I think it's really important to address important Vietnamese realities, which I think very often go kind of ignored or neglected. And I think that, the story that the book presents as far as Nixon, Kissinger, the Americans generally is again, truly wonderful. But I think when it comes to Vietnam, it becomes a little problematic. And I just want to address some of the issues, and I really look forward to getting your thoughts on my comments. The war in Vietnam was fundamentally a civil war, in which the Americans imposed themselves, starting in the 1950s by supporting France, and then after 65 by intervening directly in it. And I think that's really important. If we're going to make sense of Vietnamese history in the post-1945 period, it's absolutely imperative to recognize that as much as there was a very meaningful and influential communist presence and movement in Vietnam, there was also a very active non-communist, anti-communist, nationalist opposition to that movement. And this conflict between Vietnamese communists and Vietnamese non-communist nationalists really shapes the course of Vietnamese history after 1945, much more so, I would argue, than French involvement and American involvement in that period. In many ways, the French and American wars in Vietnam are conditioned by this existing Vietnamese civil war. And you touch upon some of these things in the book, Carolyn, but you, generally speaking, you kind of gloss over this. And I think partly as a result of that, I think the book perpetuates some of the more traditional standard notions about what's happening in Vietnam. So for example, you write that North Vietnam was powered by a fierce nationalism. You mentioned that the North wanted to reunify the country, and that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were, for their part, patriots who simply wanted to reunify their country. And again, that's the kind of the standard line, right? But fundamentally, this is Vietnam's the Vietnamese communist grand narrative. This is history as the communists themselves have been presenting it. And now we know, on the basis of research done by those of us who've been going to Vietnam, that grand narrative is effectively largely propagandistic in nature. And I think also the problem with that grand narrative is that it ends up validating some really misguided notions about those who worked against Ho Chi Minh and his comrades and the communist movement. At the time, the communists dismissed their Vietnamese opposition as lackeys of the French, as puppets of the Americans, or as traitors to the nation. And I in places, Carolyn, I feel like you kind of perpetuate some of these notions, right? You talk about Saigon as an authoritarian, unpopular government, and its armed forces as unmotivated and riddled with corruption and incompetence. You write that American reasons for protecting the South Vietnamese government lacked validity. You mentioned that the South Vietnamese army was incapable of fighting effectively against their northern enemies. And then you ask, was the preservation of a South Vietnamese dictatorship a cause worth dying for? And the reality is, for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Vietnam, it absolutely was, if only because the Southern dictatorship was always so much more preferable to the dictatorship in the North. And, consistent with this idea, Carolyn, right? If President Thieu in Saigon was guilty of, quote, high-handed despotism, what then do we call the exercise of absolute power by Les One, Ho Chi Minh, and other communist leaders above the 17th parallel? There's a statement you made that really made an impression on me. You mentioned, you write, I think it's in the intro, how could anyone believe that these resourceful tunnel dwellers would be intimidated by American military power? And if I read you correctly, part of this was informed by a visit that you made to the Cuchi tunnels outside of Saigon, and that visit seemingly left a very deep impression on you. But I think the idea that anyone living and fighting in those tunnels would not be intimidated by American power is very problematic, as any Vietnamese who ended up at the receiving end of American bombs, American shells, or was involved in combat against American and Allied forces, the whole experience from beginning to end was not just intimidating, it was absolutely terrifying. The men and women who fight against Saigon, against the Americans, they're just like Americans, they're taking orders from superiors. They're not doing this organically, naturally, because they want to. And I think I'm gonna conclude with this before I ask my questions. And I think a lot of this is related to this very problematic tendency I actually wrote sick tendency in my notes, but I'm going to say problematic tendency that Americans have when it comes to actual warfare. You know, for all that we especially we in universities and colleges say is wrong with war, fundamentally, Americans generally look at warfare as something heroic, as something glorious, even as something romantic. And all of this is on full display when you look at how we're looking at the Russian war in Ukraine, right? The suffering caused by the war is entirely lost on Americans. This is a great fight fought by great people against an evil enemy, and all the death and suffering that goes into war. The war on the ground is lost on us. And I really think that as long as we keep thinking that the Vietnamese who fought the Americans were acting purely on the basis of nationalist or patriotic convictions, we'll keep denying their humanity. We'll continue to simplify the great complexities of Vietnamese history in the modern period. And we'll never really able to understand both the course and the outcome of the American war in Vietnam. So those are my comments. My questions for you, Carolyn, there's two of them, and they relate to them, right? Is it really fair to denounce the defense of South Vietnam as just an act of support for a foreign dictatorship? I mean, Americans are more than their government. I mean, why can't we think of the South Vietnamese as more than their government? And then is it not problematic in light of how long the war lasts, in light of how many South Vietnamese died protecting the South? Is it not problematic to suggest that Hanoi, North Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh had a complete monopoly on Vietnamese nationalism and Vietnamese patriotism? I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. And I'm just processing your remarks and questions. To some degree, I think you're actually assigning opinions that I don't really express in the book, and which I don't believe in. I don't think it's there. For example, I never denied in this book that communism was an important aspect, certainly for the North Vietnamese government, and certainly for many members of the provisional revolutionary government. I'm not aware that I, tried to make that separation. So I just want to, make that clear. The other thing is that you read a number of quotes, and I think the context is relevant, because many of the things that are in my book that are negative about the Saigon regime and Arvin are not my, independent opinion based on no military experience whatsoever. It's what Nixon and Kissinger were saying. Right? I mean, their contempt for the South Vietnamese is all over the place. And, they think, I didn't, come equipped with all my quotes, which are in the book, but, I think there's one moment which I think captures everything, when I forget they're annoyed at the Saigon regime, and Henry Kissinger says to Nixon, let's face it, President Chu is a dope, right? Or elsewhere where he says, we're in this thing because that son of a bitch knows that he can't win a fair election. And so we're getting stuck because he's afraid of being exposed to his own population. These are judgments that Nixon and Kissinger made, not me. So I really want to, emphasize that. I do think you're right that there's, if you want to say a bias, I don't know if it's a bias, but it's a point of view, and I guess my primary point of view is obvious, which is, what are we doing in that country, right? Why are our troops there? I'm not the expert on, which Vietnamese deserve to be in charge of Vietnam or what the border should be. But it's really, what is our role in Vietnam? And I think there it's pretty clear. And one thing, again, that really is dominant, when you look over those 4 years, except for maybe year one, is there's growing contempt by the American officials for the army of South Vietnam. If that's their contempt, it's not my contempt. So I really want to emphasize that.
Thank you. Thanks, Pierre, for your really penetrating comments and questions. And Rusty, for your response. I owe Pierre an apology. I introduced him with the wrong university. Just as I was reading your introduction, a bunch of ring alerts came across my screen and I couldn't see anything anymore. So it's San Diego State University that has the honor and privilege of being your academic home right now. We'd like to bring our audience into the conversation. Again, two ways to do this. Our preference is for you to use the raise hand function, and you'll get put into a queue, and I'll call on you and we'll ask you to unmute yourself, or you can post your comments in the Q&A function, and I'll get to those if we have time. Let's go with that to our first speaker, Steve Brady. If you could please unmute yourself, Steve Brady.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so this has made me extremely excited to read the book, which I have a copy of. Thanks very much. And I wrote out an elegant question, and now there's a cat on top of it, so I'll try to make it as quick as possible. One of the things that really strikes me in my work is something that you started out with, Professor, which is that the anti-war movement really has a sense, the people in the anti-war movement really have the sense that they didn't accomplish much. And you can see that with the moratorium being such an important factor for them, and the war still going on, years after that. But the perception on the part of people, whether it's Kissinger or, William Buckley or current revisionists, who say that this was a winnable war that was undercut by the anti-war movement. So my question is simply, could you say a little bit more about that and that dynamic? Because I've talked to a couple people who are still around who are the anti-war movement, Tom Fox and they are convinced they didn't accomplish anything. So could you just say a little bit more about why you think that is?
Is the question, why do people feel that they weren't accomplishing anything? Or?
Yeah, even after the war ended, why do they still have this perception?
Well, I think it's really a good question, and I think you're also right that feeling of non-accomplishment lingers, although again, it's mixed in terms of how people look back on that experience. But I think the essential reason is because the war went on as long as it did, right? So as a historian, I can look back and say, wow, after their first year in office, Nixon and Kissinger, they had to, with Melvin Laird pushing them, they had to take out 100,000 troops. That was actually, absent the anti-war movement, that might never have happened. But if you're just looking at the situation, you're not reading top secret documents, the relevant thing is not the 100,000 going out, it's all the people dying every day, right? And if you're, particularly if you're somebody that is, kind of turned your life upside down to try to oppose the war, that sense of non-accomplishment is really, goes on day after day. And, when thinking about this, because I was part of that movement, and looking back, I do feel a double thing, right? Which is, on the one hand, looking at the record, I'm more convinced than I certainly was at the time about how important that movement was in finally getting this war to an end. because I truly think from looking at the record, if that outside pressure wasn't there, they would have fought for more years with more dying people, or they wouldn't have won. So on the one hand, there's actually some reason to feel satisfaction at the things that were done. On the other hand, 3 million people died. 58,000 Americans died. How many people's lives, how many soldiers came back, with physical injuries, with mental problems, go to Vietnam and look at what the land looks like in so many places. How many generations are affected by Agent Orange? So it's a very paradoxical thing, which is on the one hand, we were accomplishing more than we realized. Even George McGovern had accomplished a lot, even though people dismiss him retrospectively. On the other hand, this is a very tragic story in many ways. So I think that's explaining what you're hearing.
I would just follow up, if I could, to say that, and maybe this is consistent, Rusty, with what you're saying, which is that the movement, and by the way, I would include Congress here too, the movement limited the options open to LBJ in the last year and a half of his administration. Right. Because we know how aggressive he wanted to be, I think in 68, even after his withdrawal speech, limited the options open to Nixon. But as you also point out, it's mixed at best. But that's a very good question from Steve.
Thank you. Yes, and Pierre, Fred, feel free to join in, as Fred just did as well. John McAuliffe, next.
Hi, good afternoon. Two quick rejoinders. Pierre ignores the fact that there wouldn't have been a civil war had the US not created a government in the South and frustrated the elections that would have reunified the country. In other words, if the US hadn't undermined the Geneva Agreement. I think the question of the self-doubt of the anti-war movement partially has to do with an effective, and now of course the dog will bark, has to do with an effective campaign by the US government and by some sectors of the media to undermine its impact because they didn't want it to be so powerful. But it also has to do with the radicalization of the movement of people who became despairing by the daily death tolls and by the veteran stories as they came back, and that radicalization undermined the sense of what had been accomplished. And the last part of the anti-war movement is when it did focus on Congress and did effectively make it impossible for the war to continue. The other thing I wanted to ask, and maybe Rusty can go further into it, is the issues of Cambodia are not just the issues of the deaths, or the attack on the Vietnamese, but also the overthrow of Sihanouk and the bringing of the Khmer Rouge into power. And I think the crime of having created that needs to be looked at. Traveling regularly to Cambodia soon after the Khmer Rouge were chased out, and just a month ago, I'm constantly reminded about the fact that the moral judgment on all of us about how Cambodia happened and how we dealt with the Khmer Rouge has not yet been met.
Thank you. Rusty?
Well, I mean, I basically, agree with what John McAuliffe said. I think, that the sense of non-accomplishment in the movement, then produced a radicalization of some, significant amount of people who were like watching this thing unfold, thinking about the damage that was being done, feeling like they're more, moderate efforts were not really producing anything. So, right. So it, it caused an acceleration of tactics, which then I think proved to be damaging to the anti-war movement, right? That it, that it created more enemies than was necessary. And again, I'm just sort of alluding to the documentary that's coming, the movement in the Madman. But I think one of the things that's really interesting is that when you have these really mass events, which were specifically structured to enable a very wide diversity of people to participate, that was really effective in terms of Congress, even in stymieing the White House. But that, I think that, had probably, in hindsight, had more of us felt that the things that we were doing were working, and simply that we needed to expand those activities and not, become, guerrilla warriors, I think that would have even been better. It might have, gotten the war to end, earlier than it did. On the other, I don't know what to add about Cambodia. It's a horrible tragedy. I have a fair amount of it in my book. When I was writing my book, I actually, then began to learn, much more about what was happening on the ground in Cambodia, after the things that we did know about of the invasion, but then what was taking place later. Again, just real quickly, is that one of the things that's really interesting, which I've been saying over and over again, is the lack of interest by people in high positions about information that might be unpleasant. And so one of the things that's in my book, which I learned, I didn't even know about it, was that there were 3 American reporters who, when the invasion of Cambodia started, these reporters just got into a car. One of them spoke Vietnamese, and they just went across the border to find out what was happening. And they're captured by the Viet Cong, and they're there, I think, for 60 or 90 days, and they're traveling the whole time through different parts of Cambodia as prisoners, while the Viet Cong were trying to find out if they were really reporters or not. And then finally they find out that they were. But my point is that they saw a tremendous amount in that time period where they were there, and saw many things that nobody had really seen before about what was happening in Cambodia. And these were mainstream reporters, and nobody wants to, in the Nixon government, wants to hear anything. Like, nobody said, "Oh, isn't that great? We have these people that could tell us some things about what's going on." That never happened. And I mean, the not knowing about Cambodia, about anything, except how many planes had gone to what places, the not knowing about Cambodia as this vast human tragedy is unfolding is just stunning.
And Christian, can I just say just a few things? Because, we're talking about kind of perpetuating old archaic notions, right? And these are some of them, right? So the US didn't create South Vietnam, right? The French did in 49. And of course, it satisfied their selfish interests, but it also fulfilled the aspirations of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese non-communist nationalists. The elections in 56, which we all say Ho Chi Minh would have won, if you look at the realities in North and South Vietnam, chances are, if somehow you have free and fair elections in both the North and the South, Diem, the South, wins the elections. The North is a basket case in 56, whereas in the South, everything is going right. The Khmer Rouge, Hanoi literally created the Cambodian communist movement, right? The US bombing radicalized it. But to say that the US bombing creates the genocidal Khmer Rouge, I mean, listen, the US bombed Laos more heavily. And Laos doesn't produce a genocide, right? So I think American agency is important here, but fundamentally we have to start recognizing that local agency also matters. That this was a tragic war, and the Americans made dumb decisions, but so did different parties in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
I mean, it's possible. It's possible that not to try to adjudicate this, but it's possible that both John McAuliffe and Pierre are correct. Certainly true that there is civil strife, no question, in Vietnam from an early period. And that, I think, would have been there absent a French war. That would have been there absent an Americanization. But you could also argue, and maybe this is the point that John McAuliffe is making, is that absent the dispatch of large numbers of French troops and massive amounts of French firepower, and then absent the dispatch of American troops and American firepower, you're not going to have a bloody, huge war that claims the kinds of hundreds of thousands, millions of lives that we saw. So,
and absent Soviet and Chinese involvement, no, the foreign involvement intensifies everything, but fundamentally, right, these are Vietnamese realities.
Well, it's not a Cambodian reality, right? I mean, at the point that the United States intervenes in Cambodia, how large is the Khmer Rouge? About maybe 3,000 people at the most. And I don't see that there's any basis for saying that if the United States had stayed out of Cambodia, that things would have developed there in the way that it did. I mean, it seems so clear that the American behavior in that country, and initially it's secret bombing, like that's at the border, right? But as you know, as that situation proceeds, the United States is bombing, the interior of Cambodia, as well as, the border areas where the North Vietnamese are present. If that hadn't happened, I think that Cambodia pretty obviously would not look anything like, what the tragedy that it became.
But that's the thing, right? If North Vietnamese troops are not in Cambodia, then none of this happens. But again, I think balance is important here, right? The Americans don't just wake up and start bombing. They bomb because North Vietnam has essentially regionalized the war. So I think, again, it's local agency here that is very important.
But the North Vietnamese had not penetrated far into Cambodia. And I don't think that there's a balance there. I think you have to take into consideration the relative power of the participants. The amount of military power that the United States pours into Cambodia, not just the invasion, but bombing that essentially never stops in that country, that is far more consequential than anything that was done by other actors, until, of course, the Khmer Rouge, years later has become, vast. The country's a total mess, and the Khmer Rouge is able to take over. But I don't think that there's any equivalency here in terms of responsibility for what happened to people.
Thank you. When Eric and I daydream about how we'd like these seminar discussions to go, this is it. So thank you for this really interesting and fascinating back and forth. Let's bring in Mary Dujak. Mary, please unmute yourself and welcome back.
So great this program is so great, and thank you for letting me ask my question. Carolyn, I have the book. I'm so excited to read it. And I wanted to just raise one point about, you emphasized that the anti-war movement had an impact. And one of the reasons that that's so important, when we think about the sort of long course of forever war in the United States, it shows that the American people actually have an ability, whether or not they use it, to restrain U.S. war power. So I just wanted to drill down on that a little bit. You and Fred both said that the anti-war movement limited LBJ and Nixon's options, and exactly why, could you say more about that? How did it limit their options? Was it that they were worried about electoral issues? Was it that they were worried about poll numbers or their legacy? Was it that the anti-war demonstrations sort of sucked the air out of the room politically and undermined their ability to get other policies enacted? I mean, tell me more about the dimensions of how the impact of the anti-war movement affected thinking within both administrations, such that they then limited their military options.
Well, we probably would need another 2 hours for this seminar to answer your question, Mayor. We just had a couple of things, and Fred, from his work on the Johnson years, may want to chime in. I mean, first of all, we talk about Lyndon Johnson. I mean, the most obvious way it limited things was that after Tet, there was an electoral challenge to Lyndon Johnson, right? And he ultimately pulls out of the election altogether, right? Because he's about to be defeated, embarrassingly defeated in a primary in Wisconsin by Eugene McCarthy. But what that translates into in terms of policy is that Johnson, does in fact open up negotiations with North Vietnam, right? And becomes willing to at least contemplate that they're going to stop the bombing, which eventually of the North, which eventually happens. So that influence, I think, is very direct. And again, I emphasize in the book that that it hung over Nixon. Johnson's fate really hung over Nixon because Johnson had been pretty popular as a president, actually. And he, it seemed like opposing him was like a no-brainer. But again, I really want to emphasize negotiations were very important at that point and the cessation of bombing. In addition to which, just to transition a little bit from Johnson to Nixon, the other thing, of course, is that General Westmoreland has asked for 200,000 more troops, as a sequel to Tet. And that becomes really unthinkable. And, partly this is where historians part company. Some historians say, well, that happened because the wise men, these important, people, national security people, all got together and they told Johnson, 200,000 more men, it's not like, that can't happen, right? But they didn't act in a vacuum either, right? They have a country that's erupting politically. They have their own children that no longer speak to them, right? So there's all of that. Then moving back, so I'm poaching on Fred's territory, but moving back then to Nixon, again, I think the single most important effect was the removal of troops, that he had to keep taking those troops out. And therefore, by October of 1972, there are no more combat troops in the country. So that's a very powerful limitation, right? I mean, and Nixon and Kissinger understand that while bombing has a certain function and maybe even can prevent the enemy from, consolidating a victory, you can't just year after year keep bombing an enemy and think that this is going to lead to anything. So, Mary, I think that's the important thing. And then again, I think there's an electoral consideration, and some of it is like two steps. Right. So, for example, when George McGovern was running through all those primaries in the Democratic Party, right, and suddenly, Humphrey and Muskie and all these kind of centrist people on the war now have to face McGovern and his, and his movement, this pushes the whole party into an anti-war stand. Now, to some extent, that would have happened just because the party hates Richard Nixon, right? But that's true. But it's also true that all that popular mobilization behind the McGovern candidacy really has a very large impact. And I would emphasize that it is a powerful factor for Nixon that he doesn't think he's going to have the votes in Congress to continue the war. He really feels that way. And he's extremely frustrated that the South Vietnamese government or the top officials in that government don't understand how the American system works and imagine he has a freedom of action that he no longer has. So, Mary, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but hope to be in the ballpark.
One of the things I've said somewhere, Mary, in print, can't remember where, but I said that for all of the 5 presidents who dealt with Vietnam in a serious way, the outcome in Vietnam mattered principally in terms of the damage it could do to their domestic political position. I was being deliberately provocative, so it's maybe a little overstated, but I think in broad outline, I would defend that statement. And so it, I think, goes with what Rusty has just explained about the degree to which these 2 gentlemen, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Milhous Nixon, see all of their options on Vietnam through the lens of their domestic position and, as Rusty says, their re-election.
Thank you. David Anderson. And if we can keep it, both the questions and answers succinct, then we might be able to get to a couple more. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate this session very much, and I'll be brief. Rusty, congratulations on a great book. I've started reading it. I'm looking forward to getting to the Russia-China parts toward the end. but I have a very specific question about decent interval. You've been living with Nixon and Kissinger for a while now. And when I did my work on my Vietnamization book, I found a space between the two men on decent interval. I felt like that Kissinger was cynically thinking that way for quite a while. Nixon was holding out some hope that maybe there was some other outcome for Saigon. I'm just curious your take on the whole decent interval notion.
I'm very ambivalent about it. I think you're right in a general way. I think that Kissinger, was more cynical about all of it. And so he thought the South Vietnamese government was very weak. He thought Arvin was incompetent. So, he took more seriously, I think, than Nixon did, that when the U.S. pulled out, that it would, ultimately, would result in a defeat of the South. So I think there is that difference. But, part of the problem is, and for a historian, and you're reading these transcripts, is that at different moments, people say different things, right? So, there's moments when they're very coldly realistic, and you have these moments with Nixon also, these moments of clarity, and so, yes, the decent interval way of thinking is relevant, then other times he deludes himself for a while, then he comes back, which is really a lesson in research, because it's so tempting, to just take one sentence out of context. And the real challenge is to sort of look at the overall arch. I think the general point is that neither Nixon nor Kissinger were very optimistic at the point the Paris peace agreement was being signed. They were, neither of them really had much hope that the South Vietnamese government was going to survive, although the issue was how long would it take before it fell.
Thank you. Kenton Clymer, if you could please unmute yourself, Kenton. There you go. No, no, please unmute yourself. You're still muted. We can't hear you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry for the delay. Thanks, Christian. I wanted to go back to Cambodia for just a moment with Carolyn. I have thought that one of the great and the root power. I have thought that that Kissinger's refusal to negotiate with Sihanouk, who had been overthrown by Lionel, of course,
Yes.
his failure to, his lack of interest in negotiating with Sihanouk was extremely important in bringing about the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Only very late in the game does he allow Americans to talk directly with Sihanouk. I just wondered if that was something you got into, something you thought about.
I didn't get into it in detail, but I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I mean, but again, the level of cynicism about the situation in Cambodia is really just startling.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, there are many number of points at which whether it would have been possible to bring Sihanouk back, where there might have been that opportunity, there was very little interest in having that happen. I would say really fast, one sense that I have, which I know is different than some other critical historians actually, is I think that Kissinger was, and probably Nixon was surprised when Sihanouk was overthrown. I know that there are historians who, see it as all orchestrated from Washington. I don't think that was true. I think that from the record, they actually seem to be genuinely surprised. I wouldn't discount the possibility that there were CIA people on the ground who were conspiring in that way, but I think they were, even Kissinger was ambivalent about what the consequence of that overthrow would really be, and thinking maybe that wouldn't be so advantageous for the United States.
Thank you. Unless Fred and Pierre, you have any final words, I'm afraid we have to bring this session to an end. Lots more questions in the Q&A and even more comments as well. We'll try to capture those for Rusty. So terrific session. Thank you, Carolyn, Fred, Pierre, of course, Eric. And it's over to Eric for final words.
My thanks to everyone as well. Please join us on Monday, March 6th, for the next session of the Washington History Seminar that will explore Claire Arsenis's America's Philosopher, John Locke at American Intellectual Life, with discussants Leslie Butler and Holly Brewer. And on the following week, take note, March 13th, the seminar features a new book by Melvin Leffler, Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush and the Invasion of Iraq. And for those of you who are in the Washington, D.C. area, we will be in person and would love to see you at the Wilson Center itself. But for those of you not in Washington, we'll have a hybrid option for you to watch online. Till then, stay safe. Good night, everyone, and thank you.